Today, I'm speaking with Paul Nyland, the founder of Lifeline Ukraine, which is the country's first national professional 24/7 suicide prevention and mental health support service. Initially, Lifeline Ukraine was being set up to address one of the most serious social questions in Ukraine, the heartbreaking suicide rate in Ukraine's veterans community. But this need is likely to be even greater when the war is finally over and Ukraine victorious, as the full extent of individual trauma comes to light.
It's a pleasure to speak with you, Jonathan.
Before we jump into the bigger political issues, I'd really love to learn a little bit about your history and how you came to set up Lifeline Ukraine.
The establishment of Lifeline Ukraine began with an initiative by the health minister at the time, Dr. Uliana Supran. She had commissioned a report from Lifeline Australia, in actual fact, and they came up here and they presented to her a set of recommendations about how Ukraine would go about, or how somebody in Ukraine would go about establishing this essential service, really. I mean, every country has to have a suicide prevention hotline. The idea, the recommendations were kicking around inside the Ministry of Health for a period of time, until one day Uliana just put me in copy on an email and she said, bring Paul Nyland into the next meeting on this. And that was the beginning of it. And yeah, as you said, we initially we had a focus to avert suicide specifically among the veterans community. But over time, and this was always my initial goal anyway, we evolved into the National Suicide Prevention Hotline, and we're contacted by people from all walks of life from all over Ukraine nowadays.
And was this very much in response to the 24 invasion, or did it happen in the years after that?
So, yes, in response to the invasion. I mean, the number of veterans that we have in Ukraine, the number of people who've seen active service in the Donbass since 2014 is incredibly high. There's several 100,000 of them. And that presented us with a very specific issue that we knew that we needed to address. And so, yeah, that's the reason why we came into being.
And of course, I mean, I think a lot of people won't know the huge exposure amongst the population. On the one hand, it's a strategic advantage, isn't it, to have so many people with combat experience. And now this has blown into full-scale war. It means there's a lot of people who have exposure to that, the techniques, etc. On the other hand, that's a huge sort of social pressure, psychological pressure, isn't it, for people to be exposed to that, not just once, but potentially multiple times, to these combat situations.
So yes, that's exactly what happened. So with the number of veterans being in the several hundred thousands, they all formed a part of the military reserve. And on February the 23rd, the day before the all-out invasion began, the reserve was activated. And so Ukraine's standing army almost doubled in size overnight, and they are battle-hardened and war-experienced frontline fighters. And Russia didn't know what they were coming up against, and now they're finding out.
And what's your background? I mean, you're obviously looped into this email. Someone thought you'd be ideal to set this up. What's your background and experience that led you up to this point?
So my background is in business in general. I've been in Ukraine for 20 years now, and in that time I've done several things. I was involved in attracting foreign direct investment into commercial real estate objects for a number of years, and that was something that proved to be quite successful up until the global financial crash in 2008. And then following that, I had the opportunity, because of the financial crisis, in fact, I had the opportunity to buy some publishing assets and set up a publishing business, which I ran for a decade. And the economic fallout after the revolution, and because of the beginning of the armed hostilities in 2014, meant that was something that was sadly unsustainable. Many companies were cutting their advertising budgets, and the exchange rate between the US dollar and the hryvnia tanked very, very seriously. And, we had fixed outgoings in hard currency. So unfortunately, that came to an end. It was a shame because I really enjoyed being in publishing. I really enjoyed having those assets and, well-known magazines here in Ukraine. But then I was looking around for other things to do, and I was keeping myself busy with various different projects. And yes, then I got looped into that email, and in a few days' time, in actual fact, Lifeline Ukraine will celebrate our third anniversary of the commencement of our operations. The 14th of October was the date that we launched. We went live, and we've been live 24 hours a day, 7 days a week ever since.
And the timing is extraordinary, isn't it? Because the amount of work, I guess, you're going to have to take on once Ukraine is victorious, and as those occupied territories become liberated, an awful lot of trauma is coming to light, isn't it? And at the moment, I guess people are perhaps suppressing or repressing a lot of that trauma just by the act of trying to survive and live, whether they're abroad and just trying to make do in, say, the UK or Europe. But at some point, they're going to have a moment of peace, and that's all going to sort of well to the surface, isn't it? What's your experience of how that works and how to deal with it?
So I think there's several different answers to the question. The first one is that we're already seeing a massive increase in demand for support from Lifeline Ukraine. Prior to the all-out invasion, before the 24th of February, we were consistently taking approximately 1,000 calls per month, which I thought that was already quite a high figure. But the demand for support from Lifeline Ukraine has almost tripled. And we can have as many as 3,000 calls or close to 3,000 calls within a month now. That's one part of the answer. I think another part of the answer is that after the victory, while the worst of the fighting is still ongoing, it's not time to take stock. It's a focus on the immediate and present needs of the country and on things like you said, like basic survival, whether you're involved in the war effort or whether you're a regular civilian. It's all about survival, in particular the last few days as well, with the massive missile attacks that we've seen across the country. It makes it very, very difficult. But after the victory, I think that there's going to be a lot of euphoria here in Ukraine, and that will carry us through a certain period of time. I also think that the reconstruction of Ukraine is going to be a really glorious part of the story of this country as well. And that's something that will also buoy the nation and keep us going. But at the same time, there are huge numbers of individuals who are affected one way or another by this war. And you mentioned people who are sitting overseas, Ukrainians who've become refugees and gone to safer third countries. It's not only the refugees overseas, but there's something like 7 million internally displaced people within Ukraine as well. And for all of those people, if you add them up, 7 million internally displaced and 3.5 million refugees, that totals 25% of the population of the country. That's a huge number of people who are affected psychologically because of the fact that they're no longer surrounded by the things that they were familiar with, whether it's their playground and the other children that your kids are used to playing with, or whether it's just the comfort of your own home. Being dislocated from those things obviously causes a great amount of psychological stress. But that's one of the issues that we're facing, and there are many others that are things that Lifeline Ukraine is preparing for right now. We're going through a period of learning. We're doing intensive training with some of the best experts in the world in certain subject matters that are very, very relevant to the situation in Ukraine as a result of this phase of the war, and people living under occupation, people processing bereavement, people who have been victims of sexual violence. All of these things and of course the people who are displaced, all of these things are issues that we're adding to our toolkit to be able to respond to be able to help people who've dealt with these things by going through this huge learning exercise that we're doing right now.
And I think it's very easy, isn't it, to underestimate the trauma of people who actually have had to flee and live abroad. You sort of think of those as the lucky ones, etc. But we have a lot of people near where we live, and a lot of people we've been supporting. And if you just think about what they've been through, I mean, one family in particular, I won't say which city, but a city on the Azov coast, you know, they know that Russian soldiers camped in their house. They know their possessions, you know, and their property were violated. They know that, as you say, their school, their swimming pool, their children's play park, all these places that had meaning and memories for them are not just violated, but in many cases don't exist anymore. Mm-hmm. And at the moment, you know, they're in English schools. They're trying to sort of, you know, get jobs here and there. They're learning English. There's stuff to keep them busy, but just thinking about the things that have happened to them, they're deeply, deeply traumatic, aren't they? And in some cases, they may not be able to return to those towns for years.
That is an accurate description of the problem. But then there are two ways that we have to view the situation here. One is the macro perspective, and one is the micro perspective. And so you're describing one family whose circumstances are that they had to leave their home because it was occupied by Russians, and you know they fled to a warm welcome from everything that I hear. You know, the way that Ukrainian refugees have been treated, very specifically by our neighboring country Poland, but all over my home country of Ireland. I know that lots of Ukrainians have resettled there as well. And so you take the micro view of one family's experience, but then the macro view again is that this has happened over 10 million times. You know, that is the scope, that is the scale of the problems that we're going to have to be dealing with, and it will be many, many years that we'll be dealing with them for. And I mean, if I go back to talking about, you know, from a military perspective, because that was why we were first established, I organized, again at that time, the very best in the world, leading experts to come to Ukraine and to train my team. And our third international training session included a US Marine, a former US Marine who'd served in Vietnam. And while he was talking, he was asked a question about how many tours he served, in fact. And as he was giving his answer, he teared up. And I mean, he's a big burly man, right? Your typical kind of, you know, American biker, kind of Harley Davidson rider, that kind of thing. Big man, you know, served in Vietnam, did 2 tours in Vietnam, and he sat there and he cried. And you know, as he wiped the tears away, I don't know if you allow swearing on your channel or not, but as he wiped the tears away, he just said 50 effing years, and it still gets me, you know. So the kind of traumas that we will be helping the nation to process through, they're things that are really, really very, very long-term issues.
This is it. And I mean, to share a personal one there, I mean, my grandparents fled from Vienna in 1938 and 1939. Mm-hmm. And then in her 96th year, when we were cleaning out my grandmother's room after she passed away, we found a suitcase packed under her bed with essentials, clothes, and items. So, you know, 60, 70 years later, the traumatic memory of that will still affect people. And that is something that it's unimaginable that millions of people will be dealing with that. But let's turn to politics, because we've seen the attack on the Kerch bridge, and we've seen Putin's terrible retribution against civilians. I mean, what is the impression of that, you know, on individual Ukrainians, but also how Do you deal with that as a professional?
So I wouldn't say actually that the missile attacks over the last 48 hours are necessarily retribution for the explosion on the Kerch Bridge, and I say that informed by commentary that I'm reading coming out of the United States. The kind of operation that we've seen over the last 2 days, it's taken a lot more than 48 hours, which is the time period from the bridge being hit to the missiles being launched. It takes a lot more than 48 hours to plan that kind of operation, to select the targets and so on and so on. But if you want to understand the national reaction, our response to the partial collapse of the Kerch Strait Bridge was joy. Just unbridled joy. That structure is despised in Ukraine, and it's despised for what it stands for. It attempted to create a permanence of Russia's occupation of Crimea by linking Russian mainland to the occupied peninsula itself, and so taking that strategic military object, it's very important to point out. And I myself tweeted an image. There was footage of huge numbers of tanks being taken across the railway part of that bridge at the end of last month. And my simple quote tweet comment was blow the thing up tomorrow, right? And it took another 10 days or something like that, but eventually it has been at least partially taken out of commission. Yes, that was something that many Ukrainians felt worthy of celebration. I also I saw a funny tweet yesterday as well, saying that the attack on the Kerch Bridge was going to have a problem for logistics in Estonia as well, and people were going to be limited to buying only 2 bottles of champagne per household. So it's not just the Ukrainians who are celebrating, but the devastation of yesterday, of the attacks that hit the center of Kiev. This is my home, and one of the missiles struck right next to a play park, a children's playground in Shevchenko Park in the center of Kiev. And Shevchenko Park is one of the most beautiful. I mean, this is a beautiful city anyway. There was a French politician who, many decades ago, when visiting Ukraine, he said, "I've seen many parks in cities, but I've never seen a city in a park," which is what Kiev is like. But in this specific park, there is still a children's playground that we all know, that we've all been to. I have fond memories of taking my son. I lived just a few hundred meters away from there at one point, and so that would be our park that we would go to on the weekend. And it's a sacred place for us. And seeing that being hit, as well as various other things as well, it really was upsetting. And I mean, the other part of the attack was to hit our infrastructure, like an electricity generating plant here in Kiev. And so I, like many people, last night had to have my dinner by candlelight, and the electricity was turned off for several hours while they were working on repairing this thing and getting the capacity back up. And we had some mild inconvenience. Instead of watching the TV, I played one of my guitars for a period instead. But to see the loss of life from those attacks here in this city, and the people who were killed, they were commuters. The missiles hit Kiev. I mean, there were explosions throughout the morning, throughout the day, but the major first impact happened around 8:30 in the morning, when people are on their way to work, and busy road intersections with dual carriageways in either direction. That was what was hit, and it was very deliberate. Like the intention was obviously to terrorize the Ukrainian people. But the intention was also to maximize civilian casualties. That's the enemy that we're dealing with. That's their attitude.
And of course, we're endlessly surprised by Russia's actions, but perhaps we ought not to be. I mean, there's been plenty of evidence throughout this war of their not just willingness to target, let's say, educational and social infrastructure as well as economic infrastructure, but also cultural as well. Many museums were specifically targeted, many social places. We've seen I'm not going to hold back from putting a label on it. We've seen a genocidal glee in trying to erase Ukraine as a people and as an identity and as a culture. And that fits actually with a long pattern of behavior going back, through Soviet times, the Holodomor, the 19th century. It's shocking to see those historical patterns re-emerge in the 21st century, but perhaps we ought not to be surprised.
I'm not surprised. The one kind of infrastructure that was missing from your list was healthcare. Hospitals and clinics have also been very deliberately targeted. A friend of mine who's a journalist normally based in Australia, but strong ties to Ukraine, he wrote an article specifically looking at targeting healthcare infrastructure. And yes, it is methodic, and that is what they're trying to do. One of the things that I've heard consistently as well throughout this 230 days, or it's 230 days, I think now, of the war, is that there's a jealousy from the Russian invaders, the occupiers, for the standard of living in Ukraine. It was one thing that people would joke about in the early days, but there was one recording of a Russian soldier speaking to people back home saying there's a jar of Nutella in every single house. And I was sitting with Ukrainian friends of mine during the battle for Kiev. Actually, we were sitting around one evening, and one of these guys is like, it's a jar of Nutella. It's 59 hryvnias. Like, what is your problem? But the reason why they're looting and the reason why they're stealing things is because Ukraine is, by all measures, a more advanced and a more developed country, but certainly by the measure of the fact that we are a genuine democracy where we have political competition here, and we have freedom of speech and a free press, which is all necessary for a democracy to function. That's obviously an area where Russia has some catching up to do. But as a result of that, as a result of Ukraine being a dynamic and developing country, it is significantly wealthier than Russia is, and there's a lot of jealousy and spite simply that is motivating their barbarism.
Yeah, no, that's I hear that said a lot as well. And there's a Russian word for that, zavist, which is, dare I say it, is quite a strong characteristic that reemerges in Russian society. When I was living there, it's something that is often expressed as an intense competitiveness. They'll say the Russian, like the Olympics, they'll say, well, you can't have a good British Olympics and a good Russian one. Somehow ours have to be crap for theirs to be good. There's almost this sort of no concept of a win-win. And I can see that sort of driving that. But also that works politically as well, doesn't it? Because the invasion comes at a point where Ukraine was about to overtake the average urban standard of living and the per capita earnings, as it were. And I think strategically, that's also really important for Putin's regime. He can't have Ukraine on the doorstep that has, as you say, these institutions of a free speech, free press, dynamic, evolving structures, tackling corruption. Obviously, it's not fully rooted out, but having a determination to tackle corruption and development of civic institutions, to have that on the doorstep of a state which came from the same place, from the ex-Soviet sphere, from the same economic system, that would be extraordinarily destabilizing for his own people, wouldn't it?
Of course it is. And it's not only Ukraine that is providing that example. I mean, you can look at the Baltic countries as well. I mean, they've since the fall of the Soviet Union, since they retook their independence, they've all developed, obviously with EU membership and you know, as a result of their own determination to forge their independent futures, they've developed at a phenomenal pace. And yes, Ukraine has been going through the same thing. And you know, I mean, another hat that I wear, I'm a journalist too. I write for various different publications, and I've written a couple of articles, one for Byline Times in the UK, just prior to the 24th of February, in actual fact, and I wrote about why Putin sees Ukraine as an existential threat, and it is for all of those reasons. Ukraine is a model that Russians, if they were interested in changing their country, they could look to what we've done in terms of get out on the streets and overthrow those corrupt people who are looting your country, in terms of then finding out ways to root out spaces where corruption exists and challenging them. And I'm very lucky to have many friends who are involved in that fight. But I wrote an article, first of all, about 5 years ago, saying that Ukraine was at the forefront of a democratic experiment that would provide a blueprint for the wider region. The issues that caused us to take to the streets, whether it was the Orange Revolution or whether it was the Revolution of Dignity, they're not specific to Ukraine. They are generic throughout the region. You know, we had what caused the Orange Revolution was an attempt to establish an authoritarian, anti-democratic kind of dynasty, and you know, but also a dynasty as well, where you know you have the people who are in charge nominally of Russia and Belarus, who've been there for 2 decades already. That was what they wanted to establish here as well, and you know, I wrote that by challenging that, and then by finding these corruption reforms. And you know, when I talk about a blueprint, I think Ukraine can be viewed as an experiment in tackling corruption. And there are some things that we've got right. There are some things we've done exceptionally well. And there are some things that we would advise other countries that are going to go through, the same kind of transformations. There are other things that should be done differently. To my mind, judicial reform should have been one of the first things that we took on rather than one of the last. But you know, for example, the change to government procurement. You know, we invented. I mean, it was a Ukrainian creation. We invented this new platform and then put it into operation, through which, I mean, and it's called For Transparency, is the name of it in Ukrainian, Prozoro, and it saves the taxpayer well in excess of $1 billion every single year, because what used to happen was state contracts were handed out to buddies, and you know, there was obviously money going, you know, in circles between the people who made the decision and the people who won the contract. And you know, you see exactly the same thing in Russia, and probably the greatest example of that is a chap called Yevgeny Prigozhin, who, you know, we all know who this guy is now. He's the creator of this Wagner private military company. It's not a private military company at all. Prigozhin made his fortune, and that is what he spends to create then Wagner and to create the internet research agency in St. Petersburg.
Yes, that's
yeah,
right.
You know, his billions come from having been awarded state contracts, and that's the kind of thing that Ukraine saw was going on here. And it was one of the first things that we cut out. And I mean, changing, for example, the police service, which I know intimately. I was involved with them as a consultant for a period of time when they were first established. And you know, changing the nature of interaction, daily interaction between citizens and law enforcement, like that's another thing that we really got right, and that has to be fixed in both Russia and Belarus and other authoritarian parts of the former Soviet space.
And dare I say, if you hadn't fixed that, if those civil society initiatives hadn't really got going and even been given a boost in 2014, Russian propaganda would be far more effective, wouldn't it? It'd be far more pernicious in percolating through society.
So actually, it's a really interesting way of looking at it. In actual fact, when you look at elements of Russian propaganda that are still being used today and being used by certain elements of the United States and in the UK as well. One of the narratives is that Ukraine should not be provided with weapons because it's a massively corrupt state. And like you and I have just spoken for the last 7 or 8 minutes about the kind of anti-corruption reforms that we've actually gone through. So to me, Ukraine should be synonymous with a reforming rather than a corrupt narrative, and the evidence shows that is in actual fact the reality of the situation here. The other element of Russian propaganda that I simply cannot understand how it's lodged itself in the minds of a significant minority, but still a significant number of people, is this idea that Ukraine is some kind of hotbed of extremism, that we're all Nazis, and we're literally being tagged as Nazis in various different online commentary. There's absolutely no evidence to support it. Ukraine is not an extremist country. It's an extremely open and compassionate and welcoming country.
And I remember that from BBC Channel 4 coverage right at the start of the war. They fortunately moved away from those narratives, but right at the start of the war, they almost insisted on balancing every report of the Russian invasion with a report on, a particular mayor or a particular subsidiary local figure who might have been an extreme nationalist at some point. And of course, it's completely disproportionate without, and then they don't quote the figures of actual voting patterns along those lines. And of course, I don't know them to hand, but it's a tiny minority who have consistently voted for those extreme nationalist views. If you compare it to Italy, where they actually have an extreme right-wing government, and in France, where those extreme right-wing figures polled significantly greater. I mean, this is more of a universal problem rather than something you can point a finger at Ukraine at.
So I think, and again, speaking as a journalist, speaking as someone who's quite widely published, I think one of the main errors that the media in general has made, and I won't single out anybody or any particular channel or outlet, but and again, this is something that I've said many, many times. Some journalists think that their balanced approach, both sides, is Ukraine says this and Russia says that, and so we would often see. And when I talk about the early days of the war, I'm not talking about since the 24th of February, I'm talking about since 2014. And we would often see in reliable, reputable publications and platforms, Russia denies any involvement in the conflict in the Donbass. And to my mind, if you take your responsibility as a journalist seriously, your primary function is to inform your audience of the facts. It's to find the facts and then to inform people of them. And so you can't just simply say Russia denies any involvement in the conflict in the Donbass unless you complete that sentence with comma, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary, full stop. And I'm sorry, but if you don't know that there is overwhelming evidence that Russia created the war that began in the spring of 2014 in Ukraine's easternmost regions, not just the theft of Crimea that came before that, but if you don't know that Russia is responsible for that there never really were any separatists, that it was all engineered from the Kremlin, why are you commenting on Ukraine? Like, you pick another subject, pick a subject that you're actually an expert on. I mean, the greatest example, I think, to simply prove that, and the report from Bellingcat came out in early 2015, but in that period, in the spring and the summer of 2014, as the war was getting going, Ukrainian territory was being hit constantly with shelling, with Grad missile shelling and other kinds of heavy artillery from the Russian Federation itself. And it's because they did that they managed to soften up the border, and that's how they managed to keep the entire conflict in the Donbass supplied, armed, sufficiently, supplied with ammunition and fuel and fighters and so on and so on, because there's 430 kilometers of open border. So again, if you didn't know since the publication of the Bellingcat report in 2015 that Russia was bombing Ukraine and has controlled that open border ever since, but you're not informed about Ukraine, and you're misinforming your audiences when you talk about separatists.
And there are now academic studies starting to be done that actually trace the influence and even the command structure in those occupied territories, linking key political figures to the GRU, also linking Russian criminality and Russian criminal networks as part of their strategy or their tactics to basically open those up and coerce the local populations and really, take control of the economic interests. And once you've done that, you control many of the people, and then you take over the media. I mean, there's plenty of studies now that show how that technology of occupation and coercion works. And I find it extraordinary that people will still hark back to the simplistic narratives that have been, placed into the media via propagandist routes.
They are simplistic narratives. The idea that the people of Eastern Ukraine, because they're Russian speaking or might have, family ties towards Russia, the idea that they're to some degree, therefore Russian, it's inherently false. It's simply wrong. You can look at the map of voting when the country decided that it would once again become independent. If you look at Donetsk and Lugansk, the figure there was, it was either 89% or 93%. I want to say 93% voted in favor of an independent Ukraine. And somehow we're supposed to believe that 24 years later from the beginning of the war in 2014, we're somehow supposed to believe that all of a sudden some separatists popped up out of nowhere. But another thing that you mentioned that was quite interesting is the link between Russia's actions and various figures in organized crime. And that is another thing that anybody who is a student of the way that things work in Russia, that's another thing that we all know about as well. I mean, it is in all aspects, the Russian government is the Russian mafia as well at the same time. And so, one prominent example is the guy that the Russians plucked to be in charge of Crimea after the illegal annexation of Crimea in 2014. Aksyonov ran a party that was called For Russia, right? And his party had got 5% of the votes in the last actual free and fair election that there was on the Crimean Peninsula. So that shows, the depth of support for Russia, for the party for Russia, and for what it stood for, and the depth of support for Aksyonov himself, and then he's plucked to be the leader of Crimea following the Russian takeover, and his mafia nickname is the Goblin. So again, it's a person who is of a low political support level and with links to organized crime, and that's who Putin puts in charge. It says everything, right?
And you're expected to believe that is somehow an organic process from the bottom up rather than the top down. And this is another dissonance that I find kind of extraordinary, and that is that we're expected to believe that suddenly the population of the Donbass with say close historic cultural links to Russian culture, we're suddenly supposed to believe that they are politically motivated, active, and organized. And yet, when we look at the Russian mainland, under tremendous pressure, even the pressure of this forced conscription, there is no organized mass protests, not even an organic protest like the ones we're seeing in Iran. And yet somehow that propaganda narrative, you're expected to believe that happens in Ukraine organically, but it's clearly there's no evidence of that in the cultural motherland, let's say. It's absurd.
It's a very, very good observation. I hadn't thought of it that way, but yes, I mean the idea that they collectively organized in the Donbass, and not just politically to create these structures, but militarily, it is absurd. And it is a very good observation that it's just not happening within Russia itself, or that another part of that observation which needs to be made is that any protests that are happening are protests not against the war itself, but protests against mobilization. The war is now affecting more and more people. It's come home to more and more people because people are being forcibly drafted into the military service. And then, I'm sorry, I mean, I find it impossible to have any sympathy with anybody who crosses into this country with a weapon in their hands. You are a combatant, and the Ukrainian army will deal with you in an appropriate way. But the fact that people are being sent into this theater, into this war, which is very brutal, and Ukraine has an extremely professional army right now that is exceptionally well equipped, and that people are being sent here after a couple of days of basic training, after having been to a firing range once and shot off a couple of magazines, it's criminal. It's criminal from the Russian authorities or the Russian Ministry of Defense to be putting such shoddily prepared people into a very, very brutal war. And what we're going to see and again, I cannot have any sympathy for them. They're holding weapons and are part of an invasion force, right? But it's criminal that they're being sent in with with almost no preparation at all.
And seeing some of the sort of commentary, if it's to be believed, in many cases without socks or proper clothing, certainly winter clothing seems to be in short supply, and potentially with rusty weapons and no training. It's I think when I spoke to Ben Hodges, he used that word criminal. It's a criminal abuse of Russia's own population. Well, I know you're pushed for time, but let's end it on Ukraine, because I want to end it on not the aggressor, but the victim in this war. And whereas Russians are not known for self-organization, they're not known for organic protests. Ukraine, however, since 1991 independence, has developed a strong sort of civic society. How would you class the evolution of that self-organization that Ukrainians have shown, in such abundance, especially at the start of this war? And where's that going to go? How much further has the country got to develop that sort of civic sense and its institutions?
I'm happy to answer that, but let me just say first of all that the first article that I wrote, again for Byline Times in the UK, since the all-out invasion of Ukraine, the full-scale war, was arguing that what is actually going to bring Putin down is, it was obvious to me in the early days of the war that the Russian death toll was going to be astronomically high. And I believed that when the people of Russia learned of how many of their sons, husbands, fathers had been killed invading Ukraine, that would cause them to protest and to bring down the Putin regime. I mean, the numbers now, 63,000 something, 63,500 Russian dead so far, right? At some point, we would expect them to begin to protest, but then we see also, Russian TV footage of a person having lost his son and he's showing this brand new white Lada that he's just purchased with the compensation that he got from the government, and no sense of any kind of bereavement or anything. He says, "Oh, well, my son died, but I've got a new Lada," right? And I mean, if that's indicative of the values in Russian society, then maybe my thesis about them finally standing up to Putin was entirely wrong. But time will tell. To answer your question about Ukraine, and to then bring this to a positive end, as well as the revolutions that I've experienced in my 2 decades here, there was a revolution called the Revolution on Granite as well, which was student protesters mainly calling for the dissolution of the Soviet Union and therefore calling for an independent Ukraine. And then that came to pass, and then we had to take to the streets for the Orange Revolution because an election was stolen, and the people of Ukraine simply refused to allow that kind of manipulation. They take their independence and their freedom and their democracy very seriously. And when there was evidence of significant election fraud, we immediately went out in the street. And then when what began as Euromaidan and what evolved into the Revolution of Dignity, when Yanukovych's government rejected the association agreement with the European Union, which had been more than a decade in the making, and they specifically campaigned promising that they would continue to further ties with the EU. And when they U-turned on that, it was a significant moment for Ukrainians because to be moving towards a European norm and European fairness and European legal standards, that was something that was seen as the future of Ukraine, and denying that to the people caused outrage. But then what really was the catalyst that to me, it was the day that I knew that this revolution was going to be successful. On the night of the 30th of November, the revolution was 9 days old at the time. On the night of the 30th of November, the riot police went in the early morning hours onto Maidan, and they decided to use their truncheons to beat up the students who were there. And if there's one thing that you cannot do with Ukrainians, you cannot mess with their children, and it was mainly younger people, mainly students. And the following day, the police were in control of Maidan. Sorry. The police were in control of Maidan for about 36 hours, and Euromaidan moved to another square. And I stood there all day, and every car that was driving by was beeping their horn and doing victory signs out of the windows and so on. And I knew that it would be successful. And the next day, on the 1st of December, fully 1 million people took to the streets of Kiev and then retook the square. And it was an inspiring thing to witness. And the other inspiring thing as well has been the collective national response to the war, whether it's this phase of the war or the early phase of the war. It shows how resolute the people of Ukraine are. And I consider it a privilege to live among them and to call this country my home. And for the future, Ukraine's going to have a lot to be very, very proud of, in particular as we rebuild this great country after the devastation of Russia's occupation of part of it and attacks on all of it. It's going to be a privilege to witness and participate in.
And hopefully Ukraine will be that leading state within Europe that can teach us that value of resilience and democratic values, which to an extent in the last few years feels like we've perhaps lost sight of.
And we are certainly providing that example right now, especially in how we're responding to the second greatest army in the world.
Paul, I mean, that's such a positive place to end on, especially given, the terrible things, the terrible suffering that's happened, and which undoubtedly is still to come. But looking to the future, I think, is a great place to end on. I really appreciate you spending your time talking to me, and good luck with the tremendous work you're doing.
I enjoyed our conversation. Thank you very much for inviting me to participate.